We are going to be talking about another module of principles and parameters framework of linguistic theory, which is independently called binding theory. Okay? Now, just a small note on this terminology. The whole approach of principles and parameters in natural language is also known as the approach called government and binding theory. Okay? These are the different names for similar types of explanatory tools of natural language. So, if someone asks you the differences between principles and parameters approach of looking at natural language and that of government and binding, the answer is none. Okay, they are the same thing. However, these terms independently mean different things. Principles mean something else, parameters mean something else, government means something else, and binding means something else that I am going to show you today. So, while looking at linguistic theory, we have been looking at several things. We know, first we looked at empirical facts of language in terms of its structure at the level of sounds, words and sentences. We started looking at that, and then we started looking at what is it that we call principles of language, parameters of language, and what is it that the whole approach called principles and parameters in natural language that does in terms of explaining abstract phenomena underlying language. In other words, abstract rules underlying language. And finally, how does it really work? What do we mean when we say human mind has a great role to play in learning of language? It's a unique phenomenon. We don't know how we end up speaking so much that we speak. We don't know how everybody speaks the same way in one language, within a language, or beyond boundaries of languages. So, we looked at several things. We barely touched a couple of issues while talking about differences between I language and E languages about E language, because larger chunk of what we ought to discuss in this course within the framework of this course was related to I language. Therefore, we are still sticking with how I language works and what is it that a particular linguistic theory provides us with to understand natural language. And in continuation of that, we are going to be looking at binding theory. Okay, what is it that we call a binding theory? Okay, like I have been telling you all the time, names are names. Names mean anything only in the context, like we have discussed about words too, that they are arbitrary. They acquire meaning when we provide the meaning. They don't mean anything by themselves. Okay, there is no reason why something should be called that thing. Okay, so same thing applies here. However, let's look at what we mean by binding theory. We begin with looking at some examples. Okay, but even before we look at example, just a sentence about binding theory. It's about interpretation of noun phrases. Okay, in a sentence, that is within a sentence, and the reason why we are saying within a sentence is because the minimum unit of discussion, the minimum unit for evaluation of anything or explanation of any sort of syntactic type is coming from a sentence. That is, a sentence is a minimal unit of study for understanding I language, for understanding structure of language. Therefore, when we say interpretation of noun phrases, we mean interpretation of noun phrases within a sentence. Okay? So we are going to look at them, and now before we look at more of that in details, let's look at some of these sentences. Stars in the beginning of these sentences represent their ungrammaticality. That means these the starred sentences are not grammatical according to the intuitive judgments of native speakers, or for that matter, this much intuition even we have as non-native speakers of English, that these sentences are not good, right? So, what are these sentences? And I have also put some of the things with colors for us to see, so that we can understand the things that we are referring to, in the sense that what are the things that we are talking about when we say interpretation of noun phrases. So, we have a first sentence, John saw himself, right? In this sentence, there are two parts. One is John, the other is himself. Assuming that we know about the grammatical relations, where one is the subject, the other is the object, okay? If we look at the grammatical category, that is the category of a lexical item, John is a noun phrase, right? And so is himself, right? By the way, we are talking about this kind of a phrase for the first time in this class. What is the meaning of himself? And if it is a noun phrase, we are giving it a broader term, which is called noun phrase, right? But what type of thing is this? It's somewhere very close to a pronoun, right? Because we have seen something similar of that sort, which is, let's look at the next sentence. John saw him, right? So, do you see any similarity between him and himself? Similarity between them, right? There is some sort of similarity between them, right? However, there is a difference too, and the difference between the two leads the second sentence to ungrammaticality. However, independently the second sentence is not ungrammatical. You see, you see the point. Independently the second sentence is not ungrammatical, and these things have meanings in terms of grammaticality of or ungrammaticality of a sentence given the interpretations of noun phrases. Okay? So, let's move little bit slow in order to understand this thing. Not that we are trying to understand the sentence, we are trying to understand a phenomena. So, there is a similarity between him and himself. Him is a pronoun, right? Therefore, we can say himself is also something like a pronoun. Therefore, it qualifies to be a noun phrase. All right? However, him is a canonical true pronoun, and we are not that sure about himself. It looks like a pronominal element, but not that sure about it. Now, a word about ungrammaticality of the second sentence. I said, and you agree with that independently the sentence is not ungrammatical, right? But this sentence is marked ungrammatical here. Can you tell me a little bit why this sentence, under which circumstances this sentence sounds ungrammatical, and under which circumstances this is all right? We know this thing, right? So can somebody quickly tell me in 2 sentences? The sentence John saw him, right, is ungrammatical if we mean John by him, right? If him stands for someone else in the discourse, then it's all right. Okay? This sounds trivial, but hang on, we'll come back to that. It has something to talk about the interpretations of noun phrases. That is to say, in the first sentence, there is a relationship between John and himself. In the second sentence, there may be or may not be. If we try to establish a relationship between John and him, then the sentence is bad. And if we leave them independent, then there is nothing wrong with the sentence, right? So that's the part we need to keep in mind. Third one, John thinks that Mary likes him, right? Sentence is good, right? Now, it has independent noun phrases like John, Mary, and then it has a pronoun him. Who does this pronoun him refer to? Clearly John, right? Clearly. And now, comparing with the first sentence, sorry, I don't have numbers here, but I'm sure you can follow. Comparing with the previous sentence, that is John saw him, the third sentence is good. In the second sentence, him could not be associated with John, therefore the sentence is ungrammatical. But in the third sentence, it's okay to associate him with John. Do you see the point? And the sentence is completely all right. So this must have there must be something going on here. Right? All right. We'll come back to that story in a moment. In the next sentence, John thinks that Mary likes himself. Is bad. Right? This sentence is not grammatical, not just because of Mary and himself. Okay? Not just because of that. However, that is true. If we say John thinks that Mary likes herself, then the sentence is good. But keep in mind, even if we put, let's say we put Peter in place of Mary in that sentence, the sentence is good, right? John thinks that Peter likes himself. Now, in that case, I don't have that sentence here, therefore I am just telling you, in that case, however, himself has something to do with Peter, not with John. See this thing? In that context, my point is, look at the previous sentence again. Him can refer back to John in the previous sentence, but himself cannot refer back to John in the sentence that we are talking about. Get my point? All right. Then, last two sentences, John thinks that he is a genius. Sentence is good. Right? Now, who does he refer to in this sentence?
John.
It could be John. Could it be anyone else also?
Yes.
Can be anyone else also, right? So, comfortably we can say this sentence could be ambiguous. Could have at least two different meanings, right? Very nice. Now, how does two different meaning come from? We don't want to go into the details of semantics, but just as a note here, how does the ambiguity pop up? Ambiguity comes in by the interpretation of the pronoun he, right? If we interpret it independently, then it has a different meaning. Then the sentence has a different meaning. If we interpret this pronoun with reference to John, then it has a different meaning, right? Get it? All right. Finally, John thinks that himself is a genius. Is not a good sentence, right? Which is to say that himself, in order to refer to John, there seems to be some problem. Now, look at the first sentence. John saw himself is perfectly all right. But when we say John thinks that himself is genius, is not a good sentence. In other words, there is no problem establishing some sort of relationship between John and himself in the first sentence. However, in the last sentence, it is not really possible to establish that connection between John and himself. These are very simple sentences. I hope I have given you in simple terms the interpretation of these elements in color, which you know as noun phrases and pronouns and nouns and stuff like them, right? And the ambiguity that comes out of them, the reasons why the sentences that are marked with stars may be ungrammatical, right? However, what we need to understand, what we mean by interpretation of noun phrases in syntactic terms is the following. What allows reference between John and himself in sentence 1, and what stops reference between himself and John in the last sentence, right? What is the problem if the pronoun him refers to John in the second sentence, right? These are the theoretical points that we need to discuss with the apparatus that we have seen so far, which are at least phrases, X bar is key, right? And then we will see, does existing apparatus give us explanation to these things, and are those explanations convincing enough? All right. So that's the purpose, and that's how we look at binding theory. So the terms like himself, herself, itself are called, these are reflexives. These terms are called reflexives. They are called reflexives or reflexive pronouns because they reflect back to something. In a sentence, for these kinds of pronominal elements to appear, like himself, herself, itself, themselves, right, they need to co-refer to some other elements in the sentence. Okay? They need to co-refer to something else in the sentence. In other words, they need to depend on something else for their interpretations. Therefore, these are called reflexives or reflexive pronouns. Okay? Now, here I have put the term anaphors. Okay? Anaphors is a theoretical term in government and binding in principles and parameters, which means reflexives and reciprocals together. Do you understand when I say the term reciprocals? Sorry?
Back to itself.
That's right. No. Back to itself is reflexive. Reciprocals are terms like each other. Okay? If we say something, John and Mary like each other, the term each other is called a reciprocal term which refers back to John and Mary. When we say John and Mary like itself, the sentence is no good because itself is a reflexive, right? And it needs something called like a reciprocal. So the elements like reflexives and reciprocals both together are called anaphors. Okay? However, like always, I give you this freedom that these terms are not that important. What's important is phenomena. Okay? He, she, her, his, it, these are simple pronouns. There is a typo. His is not italics, has got no meaning. Okay? It's just a typo. Okay. The terms like John, Mary, computer, classroom, students, these terms which are like nouns, they are called are expressions. We can still call them nouns. We are not changing anything. I only want you to know they are called are expressions because they are are expressions mean referential expressions. Okay? They also receive their interpretations in sentences. When we use a sentence, when we use noun phrases like these, okay, they receive a particular meaning in a sentence. And bear with me, I'll tell you what we mean by that. The reference of an reflexive is dependent on something in the sentence. However, the reference of a referential expression like John is not dependent on anything in the sentence. Rather, it is dependent on something in the entire world. Okay? Which is the following. with one more sentence about it. Do you know how many Johns are there in this world? No, right? Nobody knows. But if we end up talking, right, and I ask you, did you know what happened to John yesterday? Right? This conversation between us and this small extraction of this sentence has a reference to John. Out of all the infinite Johns in the world, the speaker and hearer knows about the reference of the John in this sentence. Right? We vis-a-vis infinite Johns in the world, we know who we are talking about. Okay? This is why it is called our expressions. In other words, it receives its reference from rest of the world in a given discourse, for which it does not have to depend on any other component of a sentence. Making sense? It's not a very complicated thing that I am discussing, it's a very simple idea. It simply means these terms have their independent references. They are not dependent on anything else. Clear?
So then all nouns are our expressions.
All nouns are our expressions. That's right. No noun is a pronoun. No noun is a reflexive. Yes, true. Absolutely right.
So if we are talking in general terms, say computers are very smart.
Right.
So their computer is not an R. It
It
doesn't need a.
it is our expression. It refers to all the computers of the world.
So it's not. We are not trying to specify a.
No, definitely not. Being a specific and providing a specific reference. The example that I gave you was definitely of a specific reference. And the reason I was giving that example is because I wanted, you are right, I should have said that also. Whether we want to go all the way down to 1 out of infinite, or we want to put all infinite together, everything is possible with our expression. That will be the feature of an R expression. So when we say computers are smart, are we leaving any computers out of this thing? With that sentence, the reference of the word computers is to definitely all the computers of the world. Right? So true, absolutely right. Now look, just look at the specificity and breadth of the references that it is providing and that we are capable of providing in a sentence. Right? And still it's independent for its reference. Right? All right. Clear? Reflexives, pronouns and nouns. Now, I have already told you about this thing. I wanted to talk about this little later, but it's important to at least refer to this part, that a particular module of this theory which regulates noun phrase interpretations is called binding theory. Okay? And this, when we go again in details and see, this theory has three parts, and each part is given a name like principle A, principle B and principle C. Should not be very difficult for you to guess by now that A, B and C would finally end up referring to the 3 sets that I have shown you. That principle A will be talking about reflexives, principle B will be talking about pronouns, and principle C will be talking about R expressions. What is it that they have to talk is also very simple. I will show you that. But still, the internal mathematics, not really in the sense of mathematics, but the internal structure, each one of these principles depends on how we look at structure, and that we are going to show you. That I will show you. Clear? This thing? So again I repeat this thing, that when we try to regulate the interpretation of noun phrase in a sentence, this is the part which is called binding theory, and we are going to be talking about the governing distributions of noun phrases in a sentence. Are they related? Are they not related? This is part of binding theory. So, now let us look at them independently again before we look at these principles and X bar theory. Okay? So, a reflexive or an enougher now does not get its meaning from the open world, unlike our expression that I just gave you. It depends on something within the sentence. And I want to draw your attention in particular when we say within the sentence, we don't mean it in a light sense. We mean in the sense of strict definition of a sentence. See my point? Strict definition of a sentence. We don't mean it lightly that anything could be a sentence. And now, who knows it better than you what a sentence means? Right? Sentence is not an ordinary looking thing in the grammar of natural language. Sentence has its specific meaning. Right? Okay. So, John saw himself in the mirror. The term himself is a reflexive and John is an R expression, or forget about R expression right now. John is a noun. So, himself needs to depend on John in this sentence and not on anything else in the entire world. This is why it is called reflexive. Mary bought herself a sandwich. Okay? The interpretation of the term herself, a reflexive and enougher, has to depend on Mary, whoever that Mary is in the entire world. Given the two sentences, the grammaticality of the two sentences tells you that the referential part is taken care of. Right? This is what is the meaning of a reflexive or an enougher. Now, when we talk about pronouns, we have talked about it very briefly, and we have talked about its description in any grammar, whether we are looking at English grammar or Hindi grammar. What have we been told about pronouns? It's a term which stands for a noun. I am not saying that what you have been told or what we know about it is wrong. That's fine. But we need to look at it in little bit more details. Okay? In the following sense. This is not complete description of pronoun, but this is at least good enough to begin with, which is a pronoun is really little bit fishy. Okay? It's not exactly like reflexives, which is reflexives strictly depend on its interpretation within the sentence. Okay? We were looking at R expressions, and I am going to show you that also. I'm coming back to pronoun. When we look at R expressions, there is nothing fishy about it. The NPs like John, Mary, or student, professor, a pretty girl, or computers, anything as a noun phrase, okay, may or may not have a reference outside the sentence, but within a sentence, it receives its interpretation from the whole sets available anywhere in the world. Get the point? Another significant point is, it cannot be without a reference in a sentence. That is, a noun phrase must have a reference to something in a sentence. Clear? Okay. I don't mean to say more than what I am saying right now, but I do want you to understand that the things that I am saying, some of them may sound pretty obvious, but they have meaning for theoretical explanation. The explanatory capacity of the theory depends on these premises. even though they sound intuitive. Okay? For example, I gave you a description of an anaphor or a reflexive, that it needs to depend on something. You may say it's a trivial point. Yeah, we see that. John likes himself, the interpretation of himself depends on John. Right? You can say it's pretty simple point, but that is the point. The simplicity of that point lies in the fact that one needs to depend on the other, and no matter how obvious it is, it has meaning for the explanatory capacity of the theory. See, understand my point? Okay, so please bear with this, and it's good that these things may look simple to you and not too complicated. All right? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
You told that the NP should have some reference in the sentence.
Right.
When you say the sentence like John thinks that he is genius, when he is interpreted as someone else.
I'm coming to that.
Then John doesn't have reference.
No, John still has a reference. Think about it. John thinks he is genius, right? In this sentence, you are saying there are two possibilities. One, where John and he are related. That is when we are talking about the same person. In that case, he gets interpretation from John. Right? Stop talking about he for a moment and talk about John. John still gets independent reference from the world. That is to say, the interpretation of 1 prime or 1A, in the interpretation of 1A, the reference of he depends on John, not the other way around. In 1B, the reference of he comes from somewhere else, not from John. Still, the reference of John is not dependent on he. Get the point? The common thing between 1A and 1B is in both the cases, John is independent of he. Whereas in 1, he is dependent on John, in B, he is not dependent on John. Making sense? Right? And is this part clear to everybody, our expression? And that is going back to that point, that is the precise thing for which I ended up saying there is no fault of these pronouns. I ended up saying the story of pronoun seems little bit fishy. Right? And that is the fishiness which gives us ambiguity. For example, in other words, so a pronoun doesn't refer to something in the open world. That's the first feature of a pronoun. Okay? It doesn't refer to something in the open world. That is, it's strikingly different from our expressions. Right? When we say John thinks he is intelligent, right? He, in interpretation B, may not depend on John, right? But for its interpretation, it depends on something which the speaker and the hearer knows, right? It may depend on Peter, it may depend on Bill, it may depend on anybody. But it depends on something that the speaker and hearer knows about. Therefore, it is not independent in the world. That its reference is limited and known, right? Even when it is not referring to the available NP in the sentence, for its interpretation, we don't have to go too far. Not the whole world. That's the meaning of the first sentence. All right? However, it may get its reference from somewhere else and does not need to depend on something within the sentence. And that is what your example was talking about and I gave you. It may depend on something in the sentence. It may not depend on something within the sentence. And that is what creates a little bit of fishiness. And we don't mean it in a sarcastic or a bad way when we say fishiness. We simply mean that this flexibility gives us ambiguity. Ambiguity, very loosely speaking, is a strength of language. Ambiguity is never a problem. And ambiguity is not only the strength of language, ambiguity is allowed within the language. Never lose the track that we are talking about human mind. Okay, ambiguities are allowed in language because language is one of the finest product of human mind, and the strength of human mind can still get correct interpretation no matter how ambiguous a sentence is trying to be. Am I making sense? And like I said, and that's the reason why I said right in up front that we are talking about ambiguity in a very non-technical sense, because the whole technical description of ambiguity comes in the branch of semantics. It can be mathematically coded or decoded. It can be mathematically simulated, the ambiguities. Okay, and it's a very fascinating branch of a study of language on its own. So since we have not been talking about semantics in great details, and I have restricted myself to syntax, and then on the basis of that restrictive description, I told you that now you know what a sentence means, and you have seen how long hours we have spent discussing a sentence, right? We haven't discussed meaning in that sense, therefore I am talking about meaning and semantics in loose sense. However, given the fact that language is product of human mind, and human mind, the capacity of human mind, ambiguity, no matter how difficult, is a very simple phenomena of human mind. It does not, I mean, we need to figure out ambiguity, but our mind doesn't. It figures out very categorically. Look at that sentence also. John thinks he is intelligent, right? We are talking about this as a sample, as an example, right? When someone says this kind of sentence in the context, does that person even need to say anything that this time I mean he, by he I don't mean John? We don't need to say these things. We know very clearly whether it's interpretation A or interpretation B without even getting oblique reference to any one of these things. Okay, just allow me one more small point. It's not just about the interpretation of sentences. The capacity of human mind is fascinating, which you already know, I am only referring to them, is fascinating in the sense that with sentences, okay, with sentences, it reads things that we don't even say. You must have heard things like, sometimes people say something, they mean something else. Have you heard this thing? And it happens in day-to-day life. In other words, such a phenomena is a very normal pattern in society or within people, among people. Human mind has got absolutely no problem figuring those things out. You look at political discourse or political context as an example, or a very ordinary context of our day-to-day conversations, right? I may say many things without saying anything of that sort, and then you understand exactly what I say. That's the fascinating capacity and relationship between meaning, language and human mind, of which we haven't discussed much. And when I say we haven't discussed much, I mean not in a technical sense, to simulate how the underlying mathematics of that sort works. I conclude by saying that part, that we haven't discussed here, but people have worked on that to a great deal. It's a time of computer. You're free to Google and look at some of the things. That branch is called semantics, and there is another related branch which is called mathematical linguistics. And there are books after books written where you look at a book of mathematical linguistics, it looks like geometry or algebra. it will probably not even give you a single sentence like this that you see here on the screen. And it talks with the mathematical notations in the entire paper or in the entire book, talking about meanings and the interpretation of meaning. In that context, we are talking about a very small fraction of interpretation. All right, give me another couple of minutes before we stop. So, I'm glad that you had already asked this question, which I have here. John told Mary that he likes pizza. He is sometimes dependent on John, sometimes independent of John. Mary wondered if she agreed. In this case, the story is a little bit different. And what is the difference in the story? She, as the pronoun, is categorically someone else. Given the nature of the verb wonder, right, the interpretation of she is not dependent on Mary. Therefore, this sentence is not ambiguous. Clear? Okay. Same thing is clear from the last sentence. Mohan concluded that he was crazy. Right? I mean, we don't, if he refers to Mohan, then he doesn't need to conclude that. Right? In other words, nobody needs to conclude that that person himself is crazy. Rather, even if you try very hard, you won't be able to conclude that. Right? Because nobody concludes that nobody reaches that kind of conclusion. And anyway, I understand. I hope you understand what I mean. We have looked at referential expressions. So what's the problem? In fact, we have been talking about the problem all along. I haven't waited for the problems to give you in one place. So there are very specific configurations in a sentence or beyond the sentence in which anaphors, pronouns and are expressions can or must be used. You understand the meaning of configurations? Specific configurations, right? Which is, the meaning of a specific configuration is very simple. Did you read something that is in the red? Please read that, and then you will understand what I mean by a specific configuration. All right? Now, if a specific configuration is not clear, here it is. The use of himself must be within the sentence. Okay? If you use this thing across sentences, then it's not going to work. This is why, and again I am sorry that I don't have numbers, but we can find things. This is why, look at the last sentence. Last sentence is not good because himself is not part of the same IP. Now I start talking about sentences in terms of IP. Even though, if we say last sentence has one IP1 and IP2, even though they are related, IP2 is the complement of V of IP1. Clear? IP2 in the last sentence is the complement of V of the IP1. Am I speaking to you? Right? Without the structure, that should be clear, right? So, even that is true, even if that is true, himself is part of IP2, right? And that is from IP2, the reflexive in IP2 and it's the other thing that it refers back to, that's called antecedent. Okay? That technically called antecedent. So reflexives in IP2 and antecedent in IP1 is not allowed. That is what we mean by a specific configuration. The specific about this configuration is must be within the same IP. Two of them must be within the same IP. Their interpretations across IPs are not not allowed. All right. There is another problem related to the last sentence, which and you can see and you can guess, and then I stop there, and we'll discuss this further tomorrow. Himself, if you look at IP in terms of IP1 and IP2, you can see it can never be allowed in the specifier position of an IP. In the second IP, it's in the spec of IP. That is a specifier position of the IP2. What is that position for? What is that position for? Spec of IP? Subject. It can, an expression of that sort can never be part of subject, can never be subject as part of a sentence. And it's no big discovery. It simply means if something depends on interpretation for its antecedent, then its antecedent, the antecedent by definition means something that precedes it, right? And the moment it becomes the first element in the sentence, where is the antecedent in the sentence, right? Therefore, if there is one position where it can never occur, is the spec IP. In ordinary sentence also, I just gave you that anaphors, reflexives must be within the same sentence, right? Antecedent and reflexive must be within the same sentence. Someone can say himself likes John. Both of them are within the same sentence. Are they okay? No. The only reason for that is spec of IP is not for reflexives because it needs an antecedent. Clear? More about it tomorrow. Thank you.